A lawyer abandons a millionaire CEO in court, but a poor little girl arrives saying, "I'm my daddy's lawyer," and exposes a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud inside the CEO's own company. Before anything else, if this video finds you well, wherever you are, let me know how it made you feel at the end. The October morning air was crisp as it filtered through the tall windows of the Manhattan courthouse. Richard Blackwood, 52 and worth $300 million, sat at the defendant's table watching his world crumble. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Armani suit immaculate, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Your Honor," Thomas Sterling announced, rising from his chair, "I regretfully must withdraw from this case due to unforeseen circumstances." The seasoned attorney's voice cracked as he spoke, his 48 years of legal experience unable to mask his terror. Richard's head snapped toward his lawyer. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, but Thomas was already gathering his papers, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry, Richard, I can't do this anymore." Without another word, he strode toward the exit, leaving behind 20 years of friendship and the biggest case of his career. Judge Patricia Morrison frowned from her bench. "Mr. Sterling, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply abandon your client in the middle of proceedings." "I understand, Your Honor, but ethical concerns prevent me from continuing," Thomas replied, not looking back as he pushed through the courtroom doors. The gallery erupted in whispers. Richard sat frozen, his empire teetering on the edge of collapse. The charges were devastating: embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion. Blackwood Industries, his life's work, faced bankruptcy. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison said sternly, "you'll need new representation before we can proceed." "Your Honor," a clear, young voice called from the back of the courtroom, "I'll represent Mr. Blackwood." Every head turned. A teenage girl walked down the center aisle, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a borrowed blazer that was too big for her slight frame, and her sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. Emma Rodriguez was 16 years old, but her brown eyes held a determination that made the entire room fall silent. "I'm sorry, young lady," Judge Morrison said gently, "but this is a serious legal proceeding. You can't just—" "I'm Emma Rodriguez, Your Honor," the girl interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I'm here to represent my daddy, in this case against Mr. Blackwood." Richard's face went white. The name Rodriguez hit him like a physical blow. Miguel Rodriguez, the accountant he'd destroyed 6 years ago, the man who'd discovered too much. "Your daddy?" the judge asked, confused. Emma's eyes never left Richard's face as she spoke. "My father, Miguel Rodriguez, was Mr. Blackwood's senior accountant until 2018. He discovered that Mr. Blackwood has been stealing millions from his own company, hiding money in offshore accounts, and filing false tax returns for over a decade." The courtroom exploded. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, while photographers captured Richard's shocked expression. But Emma wasn't finished. "I may only be 16, Your Honor, but I've spent 2 years studying every law book I could find, preparing for this moment. My family lost everything because my father tried to do the right thing. Mr. Blackwood made sure Daddy couldn't find work anywhere, threatened our family, and destroyed our lives to protect his secrets." She opened a worn backpack and pulled out a thick folder. "I have copies of financial documents, email communications, and recorded conversations that prove Mr. Blackwood has embezzled over $40 million from Blackwood Industries, money that should have gone to employee pensions, healthcare benefits, and honest investors." Richard's lawyer training kicked in despite his shock. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. A child cannot represent—" "Actually," Emma said calmly, "in the state of New York, a person can represent family members in civil proceedings without being a licensed attorney, as long as they're not charging fees. I'm not here as a lawyer, Your Honor. I'm here as Miguel Rodriguez's daughter, seeking justice for what this man did to my family and hundreds of others." Judge Morrison looked intrigued, despite herself. "And where is your father now, Miss Rodriguez?" Emma's voice broke slightly for the first time. He's at home, Your Honor. The stress of what happened gave him a heart attack last year. The medical bills. She paused, composing herself. We lost our house, our car, everything. Mama works 3 jobs now just to pay for his medications. She turned to face Richard directly, her young voice carrying the weight of years of suffering. But I promised Daddy that one day the truth would come out. Today is that day. Richard Blackwood, the man who'd built an empire through lies and manipulation, found himself speechless as this teenage girl stood before him, holding evidence that could destroy everything he'd worked for. The judge leaned forward, clearly captivated by this unprecedented situation. Miss Rodriguez, while your passion is admirable, this is a complex financial case requiring extensive legal knowledge. Emma smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. Your Honor, I may not have a law degree, but I have something Mr. Blackwood's expensive lawyers don't have. She held up the folder again. I have the truth, and 6 years of pure determination to see justice done. As she spoke those words, Richard Blackwood realized that his past had finally caught up with him, delivered by the last person he'd ever expected, the daughter of the man whose life he'd destroyed. 6 years earlier, Miguel Rodriguez had been the happiest he'd ever been. At 39, he'd finally achieved his American dream. His accounting degree from community college had landed him a senior position at Blackwood Industries. And for the first time since arriving from El Salvador 20 years ago, his family was comfortable. Mira Emma, he'd said to his 10-year-old daughter that September evening in 2018, pointing to their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. Next year, we'll have enough saved for a real house, with a yard where you can play. Emma had hugged him tight, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. Really, Papi, with my own room. Si, mi amor, your own room, painted whatever color you want. Miguel had been working late that particular night, double-checking the quarterly reports before submission. He prided himself on his meticulous attention to detail, a trait that had earned him Richard Blackwood's trust and a salary that finally allowed Sophia to quit her second job at the diner. But it was that same attention to detail that would destroy everything. The numbers weren't adding up. Miguel had noticed small discrepancies before, a few thousand here, a missing payment there, but he'd always found logical explanations. Computer errors, delayed transactions, normal business fluctuations. This time was different. $43 million was missing. Miguel had stayed until 3 a.m. that night, cross-referencing bank statements with company records. The money had been systematically siphoned from employee pension funds, healthcare premiums, and investor deposits over 8 years. Clever accounting tricks made it nearly invisible, but Miguel's trained eye could see the pattern. Shell companies with similar names to legitimate vendors, invoices for services never rendered, payments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The more he dug, the more horrified he became. Richard Blackwood wasn't just stealing from the company, he was stealing from the hard-working families who depended on Blackwood Industries for their livelihoods. The next morning, Miguel had requested a private meeting with his boss. He'd practiced the conversation in his head during the subway ride to Manhattan, choosing his words carefully. He respected Mr. Blackwood, considered him a mentor even. Surely there was an explanation. Miguel! Richard had greeted him warmly, gesturing to the expensive leather chair across from his mahogany desk. You look tired, my friend. Working too hard again? Mr. Blackwood, I need to discuss some irregularities I found in the financial reports. The warmth had vanished from Richard's face instantly. What kind of irregularities? Miguel had opened his folder, hands trembling slightly. There are payments to companies I can't verify, transfers that don't match our records. I think someone might be embezzling money from the pension fund. Richard had listened in silence as Miguel explained his findings, his blue eyes growing colder with each detail. When Miguel finished, the room was so quiet they could hear traffic 30 floors below. Miguel, Richard had said finally, his voice deadly calm. You're suggesting that someone in my company is stealing from our employees? Yes, sir. The evidence is clear. We need to contact the authorities and... No. The word cut through the air like a blade. We don't need to contact anyone. Miguel had felt confused. Sir, I don't understand. If we don't report this, you don't understand? Richard had stood slowly, his imposing 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the desk. Let me help you understand, Miguel. You have a beautiful family. A wife, a daughter. They depend on you, don't they? The threat was unmistakable. Miguel's blood had run cold. Mr. Blackwood, please, I'm just trying to do the right thing. The right thing, Richard had repeated, walking around the desk to stand behind Miguel's chair, is to forget whatever you think you saw. The right thing is to go home to your family and never speak of this again. But Miguel Rodriguez hadn't built his life by backing down from what was right. His father had died, working in fields for pennies, so Miguel could have an education. His mother had cleaned houses for 20 years to pay for his college. He wouldn't dishonor their sacrifice by staying silent while innocent people were robbed. I can't do that. Mr. Blackwood, these people trust us with their futures, their retirement, their children's health care. Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately, Richard had interrupted. Security will escort you out. And Miguel? He'd leaned down, his voice a whisper. If you ever speak about fictional irregularities to anyone at all, I'll make sure you never work in accounting again. Anywhere, your family will lose everything. 2 security guards had appeared as if summoned by magic. Miguel had been marched out of the building he'd entered as a trusted employee just hours before, his box of personal belongings clutched against his chest like armor. That night, as he'd explained to Sophia and Emma why he wouldn't be going to work anymore, Miguel had made a decision that would change their lives forever. He would fight. Somehow, some way, he would make Richard Blackwood pay for what he'd done. He'd had no idea that 6 years later, his 16-year-old daughter would be the one to fulfill that promise. The Queen's Public Library became Emma's second home after her father's heart attack. While other teenagers spent their afternoons at the mall or scrolling through social media, Emma Rodriguez could be found in the law section, surrounded by towering stacks of legal textbooks. "You're here again," Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, observed one crisp November afternoon in 2023. "Don't you have homework from school?" Emma looked up from Federal Securities Law, a comprehensive guide, her eyes red from hours of reading. "I finished it during lunch," she said quietly. "This is more important." Mrs. Chen had been watching this dedicated teenager for months now. Emma arrived every day after school and stayed until closing, methodically working her way through every legal text the library owned. At first, Mrs. Chen had assumed it was for a school project, but projects don't last 8 months. "What exactly are you studying for, dear?" Mrs. Chen asked gently, settling into the chair across from Emma. Emma hesitated. She'd never told anyone about her plan, not even her parents. They had enough to worry about with Papa's medical bills and Mama's exhausting work schedule. "Someone hurt my family," Emma said finally. "Someone powerful. And I'm going to stop them." Mrs. Chen studied the young girl's determined face. In her 70 years, she'd learned to recognize that particular look of quiet resolve. "And you think the law will help you?" "The law is the only thing that can help us," Emma replied, returning to her book. "Papa always taught me that in America. Justice is supposed to be blind, rich or poor, everyone follows the same rules." But as Emma had discovered over months of study, the reality was far more complicated than Papa's optimistic view. She'd learned about corporate law, securities fraud, and the complex procedures required to bring cases against powerful defendants. She'd studied precedents where whistleblowers had been crushed by expensive legal teams, and cases where justice had been delayed so long that victims died waiting for resolution. Most importantly, she'd learned about pro se representation, the right to represent oneself or family members in court without a law license. "If I can't afford a lawyer," Emma had whispered to herself one evening, "then I'll become one. Not officially, but good enough." Emma had developed a system. Every day after school, she'd spend 4 hours at the library. Weekends meant 8-hour study sessions. She'd filled 17 notebooks with handwritten case summaries, legal procedures, and strategic notes. Her bedroom wall was covered with a timeline of events surrounding Papa's firing, connected by red string like a detective's conspiracy board. The hardest part wasn't learning the law. It was watching her family struggle while she prepared for a battle they didn't even know she was fighting. Papa had aged 10 years in the last 5. The proud man who'd once carried her on his shoulders now moved carefully, one hand pressed to his chest, medications rattling in his shirt pocket. The heart attack had been mild, doctors said, but combined with stress and depression, it had left him fragile. Mama worked at a grocery store from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then cleaned offices until midnight. Her hands were permanently stained from cleaning chemicals, and she fell asleep in her chair most nights, too exhausted to make it to bed. "Why don't you help your mother more, instead of always reading?" Papa had asked one evening. Catching Emma studying contract law at the kitchen table, Emma had looked up at her father, the man who'd lost everything trying to do the right thing, and made a decision. "Papa," she'd said carefully, "what if I told you that someday we could make Mr. Blackwood pay for what he did to us?" Miguel had laughed bitterly. "Mija, men like Richard Blackwood don't pay for anything. They have lawyers, money, power, people like us. We just survive." "But what if we didn't have to just survive?" Emma had pressed. "What if we could fight back?" Something in her voice had made Miguel look at her more carefully. His little girl wasn't little anymore. At 15, she was taller than her mother, and there was a steely determination in her brown eyes that reminded him of his own mother, a woman who'd never backed down from anything. "Emma, what are you planning?" She'd shown him everything that night. The notebooks, the timeline, the legal research. Miguel had been stunned by the depth of his daughter's knowledge and terrified by the magnitude of what she was proposing. "This is too dangerous," he'd whispered. "Richard Blackwood destroyed me, and I was a grown man with experience. What do you think he'll do to a teenager?" "He'll underestimate me," Emma had replied simply, "just like everyone else does." Now, 8 months later, that preparation was about to be tested in the most public way possible. As Emma sat in that courtroom, facing the man who'd haunted her family's nightmares, she knew that every hour of study, every sacrificed afternoon, every missed social event had led to this moment. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Emma Rodriguez was ready for war. The evidence that would ultimately bring down Richard Blackwood had been hiding in plain sight for years, scattered across digital breadcrumbs that only someone with Emma's unique perspective could piece together. After that first explosive day in court, Emma had been granted a 2-week continuance to prepare her case properly. Judge Morrison had been skeptical, but impressed by the teenager's knowledge of legal procedure. "This is highly unusual," she'd warned, "but I'll allow you to proceed as your father's representative, Miss Rodriguez. Don't make me regret this decision." And then Emma spent those 2 weeks like a detective, obsessed with solving the perfect crime. She'd converted their tiny apartment's living room into a war room, spreading documents across every surface. Mama had complained about having nowhere to sit, but Papa had watched his daughter work with growing amazement. "How did you find all this?" Miguel asked one evening, examining a bank statement Emma had somehow obtained showing suspicious transfers. "Freedom of Information Act requests," Emma explained, not looking up from her laptop, a refurbished machine she'd bought with money from babysitting neighborhood children. "Blackwood Industries is partially funded by government contracts, which means some of their financial records are public if you know how to ask for them. But the real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, Thomas Sterling himself. 3 days after fleeing the courtroom, Richard's former lawyer had appeared at their door at 11 p.m., looking haggard and desperate. Sophia had been terrified, thinking he was there to threaten them, but Emma had recognized something else in his eyes. Guilt. "I can't represent him anymore," Thomas had confessed, slumping in their kitchen chair like a man carrying the weight of the world. 20 years I've been covering for him, telling myself it was just aggressive business tactics. But when I saw you in that courtroom, talking about your father," he'd looked at Miguel with genuine remorse. I remembered why I became a lawyer in the first place. Thomas had brought copies of everything, internal memos discussing the embezzlement scheme, recordings of Richard's threats against potential whistleblowers, detailed financial records showing exactly how the money had been hidden. "This is enough to put him away for 30 years, Thomas had said, placing a thick manila envelope on their kitchen table. "But Emma, you need to understand, Richard has judges in his pocket, prosecutors who owe him favors. This won't be a fair fight." "I don't need it to be fair," Emma had replied with quiet confidence. "I just need it to be public." She'd spent the next week organizing the evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore. Bank records showing $43 million diverted from employee benefits into personal accounts. Email chains where Richard discussed bribing city officials. Audio recordings of him threatening Miguel and 2 other former employees who'd discovered discrepancies. But Emma's masterstroke was something Thomas couldn't have provided: the human cost. Emma had tracked down 17 families whose lives had been destroyed by Richard's theft. Employees who'd lost their pensions, workers whose health insurance had been quietly cancelled while they battled cancer, retirees who'd discovered their benefits had vanished. She'd interviewed each family, recording their stories with her phone. Maria Santos, whose husband had died because they couldn't afford his diabetes medication after their health coverage disappeared. Frank Morrison, who'd lost his house when his pension payments stopped coming. The Patterson family, whose daughter had to drop out of college when her education fund evaporated. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," Emma had written in her case summary. "These are real people whose lives were destroyed so one man could buy another yacht." The night before the trial resumed, Emma had sat with her parents at their kitchen table, the evidence organized in neat stacks around them. "Mija," Miguel had said softly, "I'm so proud of you, but I'm also scared. What you're about to do, it could make our lives even harder." Emma had taken her father's weathered hands in hers. "Papa, you taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's still right." Sophia had been crying quietly, torn between pride and terror for her daughter's safety. "What if he hurts you, mi amor? What if he does to you what he did to us? Then at least everyone will be watching this time," Emma had replied. "He can't threaten us in shadows anymore. Tomorrow, the whole world will see who Richard Blackwood really is." As dawn broke over Queens that morning, Emma Rodriguez prepared for the second phase of her battle against one of the most powerful men in New York. She had the evidence, the legal knowledge, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that she was fighting for justice, not just for her family, but for everyone Richard Blackwood had ever hurt. The David and Goliath story was about to reach its climax, and this time, David was a 16-year-old girl with 17 notebooks full of righteous fury. The Rodriguez family's fall from modest comfort to desperate poverty had been swift and merciless, like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. Emma remembered the exact moment their old life ended, October 15th, 2018, when Papa came home 2 hours early with a cardboard box and eyes red from crying. "I don't have a job anymore, mi amor," Miguel had told Sophia in Spanish, thinking 10-year-old Emma wouldn't understand. But Emma had been taking advanced Spanish classes, and every word had cut through her heart like a knife. The first month hadn't been so bad. Papa had savings, $6,000 they'd been putting away for their house down payment. He'd applied for jobs confidently, certain his 15 years of experience and spotless record would open doors quickly. But Richard Blackwood's reach extended far beyond his own company. Every accounting firm in New York had somehow heard that Miguel Rodriguez was unreliable, difficult to work with, possibly involved in financial irregularities. The rejections came without interviews, sometimes without explanations. By Christmas 2018, the savings were gone. They'd moved from their comfortable 2-bedroom apartment to a 1-bedroom in a rougher neighborhood. Emma gave up her room without complaint, sleeping on the couch while her parents took the bedroom. She'd wrapped her few Christmas presents in newspaper, pretending it was a fun art project. It's temporary, Papa had promised. But Emma could see the fear growing in his eyes. The second year was worse. Sophia took a job at the grocery store, working split shifts to maximize hours. Miguel found part-time work as a bookkeeper for a small restaurant, making in a week what he'd once earned in a day. Emma learned to cook rice and beans, 17 different ways to stretch their grocery budget. She'd watched her parents age rapidly under the stress. Papa's hair went completely grey, and he developed a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder wherever they went, convinced Richard's people were watching them. Mama's hands became permanently stained from cleaning chemicals at her second job, and she started falling asleep during dinner, exhausted from working 14-hour days. The worst part for Emma wasn't the hunger or the cramped apartment or wearing the same 3 outfits to school in rotation. The worst part was watching her parents blame themselves for their family's destruction. "I should have kept my mouth shut," Miguel would whisper to Sophia late at night, not knowing Emma was awake on the couch, listening. "I should have just looked the other way like everyone else." "No, mi amor," Sophia would reply, stroking his hair. "You did the right thing. Somehow, God will make this right." But God seemed to be taking his time, and Emma had decided to help him along. The heart attack had happened on a Tuesday in March 2023. Emma had been at school when the call came. Papa had collapsed at the restaurant, clutching his chest and gasping for air. She'd run 12 blocks to the hospital, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, fear making her legs move faster than they ever had. The doctor had been gentle but direct. "Your father's heart is weak from prolonged stress. He needs medication, rest, and absolutely no emotional pressure. Another attack could be fatal." That night, as Papa slept in his hospital bed connected to monitors, Emma had made a vow. She was done watching Richard Blackwood destroy her family. She was 15 years old, but she was going to find a way to fight back. The medical bills had been catastrophic. Even with Medicaid, the medications cost $300 a month. Papa couldn't work anymore, which meant Sophia had to find a third job cleaning offices at night. Emma started babysitting for neighbors, using her earnings to buy law books from used bookstores. "Why are you reading all these boring books?" her friend Jessica had asked one day, finding Emma studying contract law during lunch. "I'm going to be a lawyer," Emma had said simply. "That's cool. My cousin's in law school. Are you thinking about Yale or Harvard?" Emma had smiled sadly. Something like that. What she hadn't told Jessica, what she couldn't tell anyone, was that she wasn't planning to go to law school. She was planning to become a lawyer right now, by necessity and determination. Her family couldn't wait 7 years for justice. They might not survive 7 more months. Every evening, as Mama left for her cleaning job and Papa dozed in his chair, Emma had transformed their living room into a law library. She'd studied corporate law, securities fraud, and federal statutes until her eyes burned. She'd memorized court procedures and practiced legal arguments in the mirror. She'd also begun her investigation into Richard Blackwood's empire, using her school's computer lab to research public records and financial filings. Piece by piece, she'd assembled a picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. "One day," she'd whispered to Papa one night when his medication made him confused and frightened, "I'm going to make the man who hurt us pay for what he did. I promise you, Papa, I'm going to make this right." Miguel had smiled weakly, patting her hand with fingers that trembled from medication side effects. "My little lawyer," he'd mumbled. "So smart, mi niña. So brave." Emma had kissed his forehead, tasting salt from her own tears. "Rest, Papa. Your daughter's got this." Now, sitting in that courthouse preparing to face the most powerful man she'd ever encountered, Emma carried with her not just evidence and legal knowledge, but the weight of every sacrifice her family had made, every dinner of rice and beans, every night Mama had cried herself to sleep, every time Papa had checked over his shoulder in fear. Richard Blackwood had thought he'd destroyed the Rodriguez family. He was about to discover that sometimes, when you try to crush people completely, you just make them stronger. The moment Emma had been preparing for arrived on a grey Monday morning in late October. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and employees from Blackwood Industries who'd gotten word that something unprecedented was happening in Judge Morrison's courtroom. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her 17 notebooks organized in neat stacks, her father's evidence carefully arranged in manila folders. She wore the same borrowed blazer from her first appearance, but today she'd added a small pin to the lapel, a tiny American flag that had belonged to her grandfather, a reminder of why her family had come to this country in the first place. Richard Blackwood had assembled a new legal team overnight, 3 of Manhattan's most expensive attorneys, led by Victoria Chen, a woman known for destroying opponents with surgical precision. They sat at the defense table like an army in $1,000 suits, briefcases worth more than Emma's family's annual income lined up before them. "The defense is ready to proceed, Your Honor," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case that mattered. Judge Morrison looked at Emma with barely concealed concern. "Miss Rodriguez, are you certain you wish to proceed without professional legal representation?" Emma stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom on her 16-year-old frame. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm ready." "Very well. Miss Rodriguez, you may present your opening statement." Emma walked to the center of the courtroom, her sneakers silent on the marble floor. For a moment, she felt the crushing weight of the moment. A teenager from Queens, about to take on one of the most powerful men in America. Then she remembered Papa's face in the hospital, Mama's stained hands, and all the families whose lives had been destroyed while Richard Blackwood bought another yacht. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Emma began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I'm here to tell you about the biggest theft in New York corporate history. Not a bank robbery or a jewelry heist. Those crimes get attention because they're dramatic. The crime I'm here to discuss was committed quietly, over years, against working families who trusted their employer with their futures." She walked to her table and picked up a photograph. 17 families she'd interviewed, standing together outside the courthouse. These are the victims of Richard Blackwood's greed. Maria Santos, whose husband died because their health insurance was secretly cancelled. Frank Morrison, who lost his home when his pension payments stopped. The Patterson family, whose daughter had to drop out of college when her education fund vanished. And my father, Miguel Rodriguez, who discovered this theft and was destroyed for trying to stop it. Emma moved closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "Mr. Blackwood's lawyers will tell you this is a complex financial case, too complicated for ordinary people to understand. They'll use big words and technical terms to confuse you. But the truth is simple. Richard Blackwood stole $43 million from his own employees, and when my father discovered it, Mr. Blackwood tried to silence him with threats and intimidation." Victoria Chen rose smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. The plaintiff is making accusations without evidence." "I'll allow it," Judge Morrison ruled. "This is an opening statement." Emma smiled slightly. "Oh, I have evidence, Your Honor. 17 notebooks full of evidence, bank records, email communications, recorded conversations, and the testimony of former employees who were too scared to speak before now." She returned to her table and held up a thick binder. "This contains 8 years of financial records showing exactly how the money was stolen. Shell companies with names similar to legitimate vendors, fake invoices for services never provided, payments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It's all here, documented in Mr. Blackwood's own records." Richard whispered urgently to Victoria, but Emma continued. "But this case isn't really about money. It's about justice. It's about whether powerful people can destroy honest families and get away with it. It's about whether a 16-year-old girl from Queens can stand up to a billionaire and demand accountability." Emma paused, looking directly at Richard for the first time since beginning her statement. "Mr. Blackwood thought he'd silenced my family when he fired my father and blacklisted him from every accounting firm in the city. He thought he'd broken us when Papa had his heart attack from the stress, when Mama had to work 3 jobs to pay for medicine, when we lost our home and our savings. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the pain and determination of 6 years of struggle. But what Mr. Blackwood didn't understand is that sometimes, when you try to destroy a family completely, you just teach their children how to fight back. Today, justice isn't being served by expensive lawyers or powerful connections. Today, justice is being served by a girl who learned law from library books because she couldn't afford to let her family's story end in silence. Emma returned to her seat, her opening statement complete. The courtroom was absolutely silent for a moment before Judge Morrison spoke. "Thank you, Miss Rodriguez. Ms. Chen, your opening statement." As Victoria Chen rose to defend Richard Blackwood, Emma felt a calm settle over her. The battle was joined, and there was no turning back now. Everything her family had suffered, every hour she'd spent studying, every sacrifice they'd made, had led to this moment. The girl from Queens was ready to show the world that sometimes David really could defeat Goliath. Especially when David had truth, evidence, and nothing left to lose. The real fight was just beginning. Victoria Chen's opening statement was a masterclass in legal misdirection, delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. She stood before the jury in her perfectly tailored navy suit, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that gave her an almost regal appearance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Victoria began, her voice carrying decades of courtroom authority, "what you're witnessing today is not justice. It's a carefully orchestrated publicity stunt designed to destroy an innocent man's reputation and legacy." Emma felt her stomach tighten as Victoria's words filled the courtroom with doubt. "Miss Rodriguez is a sympathetic figure. I'll grant you that. A young girl trying to help her struggling family. But sympathy doesn't change facts. And the facts are these. Miguel Rodriguez was terminated for cause after displaying erratic behavior and making unfounded accusations against his employer." Victoria moved toward the jury box with calculated confidence. Richard Blackwood built Blackwood Industries from nothing over 30 years, creating jobs for over 3,000 families. He's donated millions to charity, supported community programs, and maintained the highest ethical standards throughout his career. The idea that this man would jeopardize everything he's built to steal money he doesn't need is simply absurd. Emma scribbled notes frantically, knowing Victoria was just getting started. The defense will show that every transaction, every payment, every financial decision was made in accordance with industry standards and federal regulations. Mr. Rodriguez, struggling with personal problems and facing performance issues, misinterpreted routine business practices as something sinister. Victoria paused dramatically, letting her words sink in. "Furthermore, we'll demonstrate that Thomas Sterling, Mr. Blackwood's former attorney, has his own reasons for providing false testimony. His law firm is facing bankruptcy, and he's desperate to shift blame for his own financial misconduct onto his former client." This was news to Emma. She glanced at Thomas, sitting in the gallery, and saw his face go pale. "Most importantly," Victoria continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation, "we'll show that this entire case is based on documents obtained through illegal means, recorded conversations made without consent, and testimony from disgruntled former employees who've been coached to support a false narrative." Emma's heart sank. Victoria was systematically destroying her case before she'd even presented her evidence. "When this trial concludes, you'll see that Richard Blackwood is not a criminal. He's a victim of a vindictive former employee and his daughter's misguided quest for revenge. Thank you." Victoria returned to her seat with the satisfaction of someone who'd just delivered a knockout punch in the first round. Judge Morrison looked at Emma sympathetically. "Miss Rodriguez, you may call your first witness." Emma stood on unsteady legs, feeling the weight of Victoria's words pressing down on her like a physical force. The packed courtroom suddenly felt hostile, filled with people who now saw her as either a naive child or a manipulative fraud. "Your Honor, I call Maria Santos to the stand." Maria Santos was 58 years old, with greying hair and hands weathered by years of hard work. She'd been a seamstress at Blackwood Industries for 15 years before the company's restructuring eliminated her position, and more importantly, her late husband's health benefits. "Mrs. Santos," Emma began gently, "can you tell the court about your husband, Carlos?" "Carlos worked for Blackwood Industries for 22 years, Maria said, her heavily accented English clear despite her nervousness. "He was a good man, a hard worker. When he got diabetes, the company insurance covered his medicine." "Gee, what happened to that coverage?" Victoria rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance?" "Your Honor," Emma replied, "this directly relates to the theft of employee benefit funds." "I'll allow it. Please answer, Mrs. Santos." Maria's voice grew stronger. "In 2019, they told us the insurance was, how you say, restructured. Carlos's medicine went from $20 a month to $600. We couldn't afford it." Emma felt the jury's attention sharpen. "What happened to Carlos?" "He rationed his insulin to make it last longer," Maria said, tears rolling down her cheeks. "In February 2020, he went into diabetic coma. He died 3 days later." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Emma could see several jury members dabbing their eyes. "Mrs. Santos, did you later discover what happened to the insurance funds?" "Objection!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "Calls for speculation." "Sustained," Judge Morrison ruled reluctantly. Emma adjusted her approach. "Mrs. Santos, I'm showing you Exhibit A, an internal Blackwood Industries memo dated January 2019. Can you read the highlighted section?" Maria squinted at the document. It says, "Employee health premiums to be redirected to Executive Compensation Fund pending restructuring completion." The gallery erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Morrison banged her gavel for order. Victoria was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, we object to the admission of this document. There's no chain of custody, no authentication." "Your Honor," Emma interrupted, pulling out a thick folder, "I have the complete email chain showing this memo's creation, distribution, and approval. Every step is documented with timestamps and digital signatures." Judge Morrison examined the documents carefully. "I'll allow it. Continue, Miss Rodriguez." Emma felt a surge of confidence. Victoria's perfectly crafted defense was about to meet the harsh reality of documented evidence. "Mrs. Santos, how did Carlos's death affect your family?" "We lost our house to pay the medical bills. I live with my daughter now, in her basement. Carlos worked 22 years for Mr. Blackwood, and when he needed help the most." Maria's voice broke. "My husband died because someone stole the money that was supposed to save his life." As Maria stepped down from the witness stand, Emma saw something shift in the jury's faces. Victoria's sophisticated arguments about business practices and financial procedures suddenly seemed hollow compared to a widow's tears and a man's preventable death. The battle was far from over, but Emma had drawn first blood. She had 11 more witnesses, each with their own story of loss and betrayal. By the time she was finished, the jury would understand that this wasn't about complex financial regulations. It was about greed so callous that it counted human lives as acceptable collateral damage. Richard Blackwood sat at the defense table, his confident mask beginning to slip as he realized that his money and power might not be enough to silence the voices of the people he'd destroyed. The real fight was just beginning. Frank Morrison had been a loyal Blackwood Industries employee for 18 years when his world collapsed in a single phone call. Now 63 years old, he walked to the witness stand with the careful gait of a man whose body had been broken by years of manual labor and recent heartbreak. "Mr. Morrison," Emma began, "please tell the court about your employment at Blackwood Industries." Frank's voice was gravelly from decades of smoking, but his words were clear. "I started in 2006 as a machine operator, worked my way up to floor supervisor. Never missed a day unless I was sick, never caused trouble. Mr. Blackwood himself shook my hand at my 15-year anniversary dinner. Emma nodded encouragingly. Did you contribute to the company pension plan? Every paycheck for 18 years. The company matched 50 cents for every dollar I put in. By 2020, my pension account was worth almost $400,000. Enough to retire comfortable, maybe buy a little place in Florida with my wife Janet. What happened in September 2020? Frank's face hardened. Got a letter saying the pension fund was being temporarily restructured due to market conditions. Said our benefits would be preserved, but payments would be delayed 6 months while they reorganized. Victoria Chen was taking notes furiously, clearly preparing her cross-examination. Did you receive your pension payments after 6 months? Emma asked. No. Got another letter saying there were additional complications and asking for another year's patience. Then Janet got sick. Emma could see the pain in Frank's eyes as he remembered. Tell the court about Janet's illness. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March 2021. The treatment was expensive, even with Medicare. We needed that pension money for her care, but every time I called Blackwood Industries, they gave me the runaround. Under review, processing delays, market volatility, always some excuse. What ultimately happened to Janet? Frank's voice cracked. She died in October 2021. We'd exhausted our savings, taken out a second mortgage on the house. She spent her last months worrying about money instead of focusing on getting better. The courtroom was hushed. Emma could see tears in several jury members' eyes. Mr. Morrison, I'm showing you Exhibit B, a bank statement from September 2020, the same month you were told about pension fund problems. Can you identify this account? Frank studied the document. That's a Cayman Islands account in the name of Blackwood Holdings Subsidiary 47. Shows a deposit of $12.3 million on September 15, 2020. Is that significant? According to my calculations, that's almost exactly the amount that was supposed to be in the pension fund at that time. Victoria shot to her feet. Objection. The witness is not qualified to make such determinations. Your Honor, Emma replied calmly. Mr. Morrison was a floor supervisor with access to pension fund reports. He's simply reading public documents. I'll allow it, Judge Morrison ruled. Emma continued. Mr. Morrison, what's your current financial situation? I lost the house last year, living in a one-bedroom apartment, working part-time at a hardware store. At 63, I'm starting over with nothing because the money I worked 18 years to earn just disappeared. Indeed, Emma walked to her table and picked up a thick folder. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C, comprehensive bank records showing the systematic transfer of pension funds from legitimate investment accounts to shell companies controlled by Richard Blackwood. Victoria was on her feet immediately. Objection! How did a 16-year-old girl obtain confidential banking records? Emma smiled slightly. Through legitimate Freedom of Information Act requests, subpoenas filed in accordance with federal civil procedure, and records provided voluntarily by Thomas Sterling as part of his cooperation with this case. Judge Morrison examined the documents. These appear to be properly obtained. I'll allow them. Emma addressed the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, these records show that between 2018 and 2022, Richard Blackwood systematically emptied pension accounts belonging to over 200 employees, transferring the money to personal accounts in offshore tax havens. She held up a chart she'd prepared. This graph shows the correlation between employee pension contributions and deposits into Mr. Blackwood's personal accounts. Every time workers put money into their retirement funds, equivalent amounts appeared in accounts controlled by the defendant, Richard whispered urgently to Victoria. But Emma pressed on. Frank Morrison worked 18 years believing his pension was safe. Janet Morrison died thinking they'd lost their retirement to market forces. But the truth is simpler and more heartbreaking. Their money was stolen by the man they trusted to protect their future. As Frank stepped down from the witness stand, Emma felt the momentum shifting in her favor. Victoria's sophisticated legal arguments were crumbling against the relentless weight of documented evidence and human suffering. But Emma knew Victoria wasn't finished fighting. The real counterattack was coming, and when it arrived, it would test everything Emma had learned about the law, about justice, and about herself. In the gallery, she caught sight of her parents. Papa's face showed pride and fear in equal measure, while Mama clutched a rosary, praying for her daughter's safety. They'd sacrificed everything to get to this moment. Emma couldn't afford to lose now. Victoria Chen's cross-examination of Frank Morrison was surgical in its precision and devastating in its effectiveness. She rose from her chair like a predator that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. "Mr. Morrison," Victoria began, her voice deceptively gentle, "you mentioned that you never missed work unless you were sick. How many sick days did you take in your final 2 years at Blackwood Industries?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure exactly. My back was bothering me, and according to your employment records, you took 47 sick days in 2019 and 2020. That's nearly a day and a half per month. Does that sound like a dedicated employee to you? Emma felt her stomach drop. She hadn't known about Frank's attendance issues. "I was having health problems," Frank protested. "My doctor said..." "Yes, let's talk about your health problems," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "You mentioned a drinking problem in your disability application, didn't you?" "Objection!" Emma shot to her feet. "Relevance? Your Honor, this goes to the witness's credibility and his ability to accurately remember events," Victoria replied. "I'll allow it," Judge Morrison ruled reluctantly. Victoria continued relentlessly. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you were attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings during your final year at Blackwood Industries?" Frank's face flushed red. "That has nothing to do with... And isn't it true that you were warned multiple times about arriving at work under the influence?" "I never..." "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit D1, a disciplinary report dated March 15, 2020, documenting Mr. Morrison's intoxication during work hours." Emma's heart sank as she watched the jury's sympathy for Frank evaporate. Victoria was systematically destroying his credibility. "Mr. Morrison," Victoria pressed on, "you testified that your pension was worth $400,000, but according to these official fund statements, your account balance was actually $137,000. Were you lying to the jury, or do you simply not remember accurately?" Frank looked confused and defeated. The statements I had showed. I thought." "You thought wrong, didn't you? Just like you were wrong about seeing Mr. Blackwood steal money that was never actually there." Emma tried to object, but Victoria was already moving to her next target. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Frank stepped down from the witness stand, Emma could see the damage had been done. The jury looked skeptical now, wondering what other facts might not hold up under scrutiny. Emma's next witness was supposed to be Patricia Williams, a former Blackwood Industries accountant who'd been fired for asking too many questions about financial discrepancies. But as Patricia took the stand, Emma noticed Victoria's satisfied smile and felt a chill of foreboding. "Ms. Williams," Emma began, "how long did you work for Blackwood Industries?" 3 years, from 2019 to 2022. "What were your responsibilities?" "I managed accounts payable and helped prepare quarterly financial reports." "Did you notice any irregularities in the company's financial records?" Patricia hesitated, glancing nervously at Victoria. "Well, there were some discrepancies that I reported to my supervisor." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Payments to vendors I couldn't verify, transfers that didn't match our internal records." Emma felt the case getting back on track. "Did you document these concerns?" "Yes, I prepared a detailed report in January 2022. "What happened when you submitted this report?" Patricia's voice grew smaller. "I was called into HR the next day and terminated for performance issues." Victoria rose for cross-examination with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. "Ms. Williams, you mentioned performance issues. Can you tell the jury about the $63,000 in company funds that went missing while you were managing accounts payable? Emma's blood ran cold. Patricia's face went white. That was an accounting error. I corrected it as soon as... Did you correct it before or after the FBI investigation into your financial activities? Objection! Emma called desperately. Relevance! Your Honor, this directly relates to the witness's credibility and possible motives for false testimony, Victoria replied. I'll allow it. Victoria moved in for the kill. Ms. Williams, isn't it true that you're currently under federal investigation for embezzlement? And isn't it true that you've agreed to testify against Mr. Blackwood in exchange for immunity from prosecution? Patricia broke down completely. I never meant. It was just a loan. I was going to pay it back. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Emma felt her carefully constructed case collapsing around her. Victoria had somehow discovered compromising information about every witness, systematically destroying their credibility. As Patricia fled the witness stand in tears, Emma realized she was fighting an opponent with resources and connections far beyond anything she'd imagined. Victoria hadn't just prepared a defense, she'd conducted a full investigation into Emma's witnesses, finding ammunition to destroy each one. Emma looked at her remaining witness list with growing despair. If Victoria could discredit Frank Morrison and Patricia Williams so easily, what devastating revelations did she have waiting for the others? For the first time since beginning this fight, Emma wondered if a 16-year-old girl from Queens was really capable of bringing down one of the most powerful men in America. The legal system she'd studied in books was proving far more brutal and unforgiving than she'd imagined, but as she caught sight of her father in the gallery, pale and fragile but watching her with infinite love and pride, Emma steeled herself for the battle ahead. She might be outgunned and outmaneuvered, but she still had one weapon Victoria couldn't take away: the truth. The question was whether truth would be enough to overcome money, power, and the most ruthless legal team in New York. The revelation that destroyed Emma's case came from the last person she expected, Thomas Sterling himself. It was Wednesday morning, and Emma had spent the previous night frantically reorganizing her witness list after Victoria's devastating cross-examinations. 2 more witnesses had been discredited, one for tax evasion, another for lying on a loan application. Emma was beginning to suspect that Richard Blackwood's reach extended far deeper than she'd imagined. She was about to call her next witness when Victoria Chen stood up. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Thomas Sterling to the stand. Emma's blood ran cold. Thomas was supposed to be her star witness, the insider who would corroborate everything with his first-hand knowledge of Richard's crimes. But as she watched him walk to the witness stand, something in his demeanor sent alarm bells ringing in her mind. Victoria approached Thomas with the deference due to a respected colleague. Mr. Sterling, please state your profession for the record. I'm a practicing attorney with 25 years of experience in corporate law, Thomas replied, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding Emma's gaze. And what was your relationship to the defendant, Richard Blackwood? I served as his personal attorney and legal counsel for 20 years, from 2004 to 2024. Mr. Sterling, you recently provided documents to Miss Rodriguez that form the basis of her case against Mr. Blackwood. Can you tell the court how those documents were obtained? Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't going the way she'd expected. Thomas cleared his throat. I created them. The courtroom erupted in gasps and urgent whispers. Judge Morrison banged her gavel for order. I'm sorry, Victoria said, feigning confusion. Did you say you created them? Yes. The bank statements, email communications, and financial records that Miss Rodriguez has been presenting. I fabricated them using my knowledge of corporate accounting and Mr. Blackwood's business practices. Emma shot to her feet, her voice breaking. That's not true. Thomas, tell them about the real evidence, about what Richard did to my father. But Thomas was looking directly at her now, and she could see the shame and something else, fear in his eyes. Miss Rodriguez, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger, is a remarkable young woman who genuinely believes she's fighting for justice. But in my guilt over other matters, I provided her with false documents to support a case that doesn't exist." Victoria nodded sympathetically. "What other matters are you referring to, Mr. Sterling?" "I've been embezzling funds from my law firm's client trust account for the past 3 years. I'm facing disbarment and criminal charges. When I saw Miss Rodriguez's passion for her father's situation, I thought I could use her case to deflect attention from my own crimes." Emma felt like she was drowning. Every piece of evidence she'd built her case on was being systematically destroyed. "So, to be clear," Victoria said, "the supposed evidence of Mr. Blackwood's financial crimes was fabricated by you to cover your own embezzlement." "Yes, Richard Blackwood is completely innocent of the charges being brought against him. I take full responsibility for misleading Miss Rodriguez and this court." Emma's world collapsed in that moment. Months of preparation, her family's hopes, her belief in justice, all of it crumbling because the man she'd trusted had betrayed her in the most devastating way possible. But then something Thomas said struck her as wrong. She'd been studying his mannerisms for months, and she knew when he was lying. The way he held his shoulders, the slight tremor in his left hand, the careful way he avoided looking at Richard. These were the same tells she'd noticed when he'd lied to judges about case schedules. Emma stood up slowly, her mind racing. "Mr. Sterling, you said you've been embezzling from client trust accounts for 3 years. Victoria tried to object. "Your Honor, Miss Rodriguez doesn't have the right to cross-examine." "Actually," Judge Morrison said, "since Mr. Sterling was originally Miss Rodriguez's witness, she does have that right." Emma approached the witness stand, her heart pounding. "Mr. Sterling, can you tell the court the name of your law firm's bank?" Thomas hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Metropolitan Trust and Savings. And the account number for your client trust fund?" Another hesitation. I don't recall the exact number." Emma walked to her table and picked up her phone. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a brief call to verify Mr. Sterling's testimony." "Objection." Victoria was on her feet. "This is highly irregular." "Your Honor," Emma said calmly, "if Mr. Sterling is telling the truth about embezzling from Metropolitan Trust and Savings, that information should be readily verifiable." Judge Morrison looked intrigued. "I'll allow a brief verification." Uyema dialed information and asked to be connected to Metropolitan Trust and Savings. After a brief conversation, she hung up and faced the court. "Your Honor, Metropolitan Trust and Savings has no record of Sterling, Chen and Associates having any accounts with their institution. In fact, Mr. Sterling's firm banks with First National, and their client trust account has never shown any irregularities." The courtroom was dead silent. Thomas's face had gone grey. Emma pressed her advantage. "Mr. Sterling, isn't it true that Richard Blackwood offered you something to change your testimony? Money to cover your firm's actual financial problems? Threats against your family?" "No." Isn't it true that everything you told me was real, and you're only lying now because Richard Blackwood has found a way to pressure you?" Thomas's composure finally cracked. "Emma, please. You don't understand what he's capable of. My daughter, Sarah, she's only 14. He showed me pictures of her walking to school, her daily routine. He said—" "Objection!" Victoria screamed, but it was too late. "He said if I didn't recant my testimony, Sarah would have an accident, just like what happened to your father's first witness in 2018, the one who died in that suspicious car crash." The courtroom exploded. Richard Blackwood was shouting at his lawyers. Victoria was demanding a recess, and reporters were frantically scribbling notes about witness intimidation and threats against children. But Emma heard only one thing clearly. The truth was finally coming out. Judge Morrison was banging her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in my courtroom!" As security guards moved to restrain Richard, who was lunging toward Thomas Sterling, Emma realized that her case hadn't been destroyed. It had just been proven beyond any doubt. The most powerful man in the room had just revealed exactly how far he would go to silence the truth. The emergency recess that followed Thomas Sterling's explosive testimony stretched into the afternoon as Judge Morrison met with attorneys from the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges for witness intimidation. Emma sat in the courthouse cafeteria, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. "Mija," Papa said softly, sitting beside her with a cup of coffee he couldn't afford. "Are you okay?" Emma looked at her father, the man whose courage had started this whole fight 6 years ago, and felt a mixture of triumph and terror. "Papa, did you know about the other witness? The one who died in 2018? Miguel's face darkened. "Carlos Mendoza. He was a good man, worked in the accounting department. He'd found some of the same irregularities I did, was planning to go to the authorities with me." Miguel paused, staring into his coffee. 3 days before we were supposed to meet with the FBI. His car went off the Queensboro Bridge. They said he fell asleep at the wheel. "Joaquin, but you didn't believe that. Carlos never drove when he was tired. He was the most careful driver I knew. And his brake lines." Miguel shook his head. "The police said they were old, corroded, but Carlos had just had his car serviced the week before." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Papa, why didn't you tell me about this?" "Because I was terrified that if Richard Blackwood could do that to Carlos, he could do it to us. When he threatened our family that day in his office, I knew he wasn't bluffing." Sophia appeared at their table, having rushed over from her job at the grocery store, still wearing her name tag. "Emma, mi amor, what's happening?" "The news is saying something about death threats." Emma quickly explained the morning's events, watching her mother's face grow pale with each detail. "Dios mío," Sophia whispered. "Emma, maybe we should stop this. If this man is capable of murder." "No, Mama." Emma's voice was firm despite her fear. "Don't you see? This proves everything. Richard Blackwood just admitted in open court that he's willing to threaten children to protect his secrets. The jury heard him. The whole world heard him." A familiar voice interrupted their family discussion. "She's right, Mrs. Rodriguez." They turned to see Detective Maria Santos, no relation to the Maria Santos who'd testified earlier, approaching their table. Detective Santos was a tough-looking woman in her 40s who worked financial crimes for the NYPD. "Miss Rodriguez," Detective Santos said, sitting down uninvited, "I've been following your case with great interest. What happened in that courtroom today changes everything." Emma leaned forward eagerly. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Blackwood's outburst, his threats against Mr. Sterling's daughter, his reference to Carlos Mendoza's death, that's given us probable cause to reopen the Mendoza investigation and launch a full criminal inquiry into Blackwood Industries." Detective Santos pulled out a badge and placed it on the table. "As of 1 hour ago, Richard Blackwood is under arrest for witness intimidation, making terroristic threats, and conspiracy. We're also investigating his potential involvement in Carlos Mendoza's death." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. "After all these years." "There's more," Detective Santos continued. "Your civil case has provided us with enough evidence to freeze Blackwood's assets pending criminal charges. Every penny he stole is going to be recovered and returned to the victims." Emma felt a strange sensation, as if the weight she'd been carrying for 6 years was finally lifting from her shoulders. What about the people who lost everything? Frank Morrison, Maria Santos, all the others? They'll get their money back, plus damages for the years of hardship they endured. Your case has created a legal framework for recovering stolen pension funds that will help thousands of people across the country. Sophia was crying now, clutching Emma's hand tightly. "Mi niña, you did it. You actually did it." Detective Santos stood to leave, then paused. "Miss Rodriguez, I've been a cop for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of people try to fight the system. Most of them fail because they don't understand how the game is played. But you didn't just learn the rules. You use them better than lawyers with decades of experience." As the detective walked away, Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Thomas Sterling, looking haggard but relieved. "Emma," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Emma studied his face. Are you going to tell me the truth this time? Richard approached me 3 weeks ago. He'd discovered that my law firm was struggling financially, not embezzlement, just bad investments and economic pressure from the pandemic. He offered to bail us out in exchange for discrediting you in court. Thomas sat down heavily. When I refused, he had someone follow my daughter to school. They sent me photos of her daily routine, her friends, the route she walks home. The message was clear: cooperate or Sarah would be hurt. So you decided to sacrifice my family to save yours, Emma said, not accusingly but with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much adult corruption. For about 2 hours, yes, but sitting in that courtroom, watching you fight with everything you had, I remembered why I became a lawyer in the first place, to protect people like you from people like him. Thomas pulled out a thick envelope. These are the real documents, Emma. Bank records, email communications, recorded conversations, everything I originally gave you, plus things I was holding back. Richard Blackwood is going to prison for a very long time. As Emma took the envelope, she realized that her fight was finally over, not because she'd won in court, though she had, but because the truth had become too big to hide, too loud to silence, too powerful for even Richard Blackwood's money and connections to suppress. Tomorrow, she would return to being a 16-year-old girl worried about homework and college applications. But tonight, she was the daughter who'd kept her promise to her father and delivered justice to a man who thought himself untouchable. The David and Goliath story was nearing its end, and for once, the little guy had won. 6 months later, Emma Rodriguez stood in the same courthouse where her journey had begun, but everything was different now. The marble floors still gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but today they reflected the faces of vindicated victims rather than desperate plaintiffs. Richard Blackwood had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison on charges of embezzlement, securities fraud, tax evasion, and witness intimidation. The judge had called his crimes a betrayal of trust so fundamental that it strikes at the heart of our economic system. Blackwood Industries had been liquidated, with all assets going toward victim compensation. Emma wore a simple blue dress, not borrowed this time, but purchased with money from a book deal about her experience. Publishers had been calling non-stop since her story made national news, dubbing her the teenage lawyer who brought down Wall Street. But today wasn't about fame or recognition. Today was about the people whose lives had been restored. Frank Morrison approached Emma outside the courthouse, walking with more spring in his step than she'd seen during the trial. At 64, he looked younger somehow, as if the weight of injustice had aged him beyond his years. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Janet would have been so proud of you." Frank had received $247,000 in recovered pension funds, plus $180,000 in damages. He'd bought a small house in Florida, just like he and Janet had dreamed, and planned to spend his remaining years volunteering with financial literacy programs for seniors. Maria Santos was there too, accompanied by her daughter. The recovered health insurance funds had come too late to save her husband Carlos, but Maria had used her settlement to establish a foundation providing emergency medical assistance to families who couldn't afford necessary care. "My Carlos is at peace now," Maria told Emma, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He knows the truth came out." One by one, the victims approached Emma and her family, sharing their gratitude and their stories of recovery. But the moment that meant the most came when a 14-year-old girl with curly brown hair and nervous eyes walked up to them. "Miss Rodriguez," the girl said hesitantly, "I'm Sarah Sterling, Thomas Sterling's daughter." Emma smiled gently. "Hi, Sarah. How are you doing?" "Better now that the scary man is in jail," Sarah said with the brutal honesty of adolescence. "My dad says you saved my life by catching him lying in court." "Your dad saved your life by choosing to tell the truth," Emma replied. "That took a lot of courage." Thomas Sterling appeared beside his daughter, looking healthier than Emma had seen him in months. The stress of keeping Richard's secrets had visibly aged him, but now he seemed to have found his moral center again. "Emma," Thomas said, "I wanted you to know that I'm leaving corporate law. I'm going to work for legal aid, helping families like yours fight against people like Richard Blackwood." Emma nodded approvingly. "The world needs more lawyers willing to do the right thing, even when it's hard." As the crowd began to disperse, Emma found herself alone with her parents on the courthouse steps, the same steps where she'd first decided to fight back, where she'd made a promise to seek justice for her family. "So what now, mi amor?" Sophia asked, putting her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Emma looked out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about all the powerful people in those gleaming towers who might be counting on silence and fear to protect their secrets. "Now I finish high school," Emma said with a smile, "and then I go to law school for real. There are a lot more Richard Blackwoods out there, and they're about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most money or the best connections." Papa squeezed her hand. "It's the one with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." "Exactly," Emma agreed. Miguel Rodriguez looked at his daughter, the girl who'd transformed from a 10-year-old victim into a 16-year-old warrior for justice, and felt a pride so deep it brought tears to his eyes. "You know what, Emma?" he said. "I think we can afford that house with the yard now, with your own room, painted whatever color you want." Emma laughed, remembering that conversation from so many years ago when their dreams had seemed impossible and their future secure. Life had taught her that security was an illusion, but dreams backed by determination and courage, those could become reality. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, the Rodriguez family looked less like the broken, desperate people who'd entered this building 6 months ago, and more like what they'd always been underneath the poverty and fear. Survivors who refused to give up, fighters who'd discovered that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice waiting for the right person to demand it loudly enough for the whole world to hear. And sometimes that person is a 16-year-old girl from Queens with 17 notebooks full of righteous fury and a promise to keep. In the end, Emma Rodriguez had learned that the law wasn't just about rules and procedures and precedents. It was about people, broken people seeking healing, desperate people seeking hope, and sometimes, just sometimes, young people seeking to make the world a little more just than they found it. The scales of justice had been balanced at last, and it had taken a daughter's love, a teenager's determination, and the unshakable belief that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually rise to the surface. Emma Rodriguez had kept her promise to her father. But more than that, she'd kept faith with the idea that in America, justice truly could be blind to wealth and power when someone was brave enough to remove the blindfold and show it where to look. The fight was over. Justice had been served, and a family's faith in the American dream had been restored by the daughter who refused to let it die.